Hi everyone, it's Nick. Welcome back to my channel. Okay, today we are talking about the do's and don'ts of gallery walls, because gallery walls can be super tricky because on one hand, they can look too busy and they can look a little bit too funky, a little bit too weird, and they just tend to really clutter and overcrowd the space. But also, if not done properly and you kind of go too minimal, they can look really out of place, like they're just sort of floating and they don't look like they really belong, and they just kind of look lost and confused and maybe even too small, like they lack presence in your space. So what are you supposed to do? Well, I'm going to tell you in this video, and then at the end, I'm going to give you my final thoughts to kind of give you some takeaways on how I think you can pull your whole gallery wall together beautifully. First do on my list is to plan your layout. Okay, this is really simple, but we are going to start with this one. Consider when you're doing a gallery wall, not just the individual pieces, although we'll get to that, but consider the whole gallery as a whole. What wall do you want it to take up? Is it going above a couch? Is it going above a bed? How is that going to look? And consider the whole gallery together as a unit. Consider putting green painter's tape on the wall, literally map it out on the wall, or put like sheets of parchment paper or something, and sort of really map out what you're gonna do, the size and shape of everything that you're planning on putting the gallery wall, and have a plan. Which leads me to my first don't of gallery walls, which is don't just start putting stuff on the wall. I think a lot of people think that a gallery wall is put something on the wall and then go like, oh, that's cool, and then just like keep adding to it and adding to it, and before you know it, it doesn't feel cohesive, it doesn't feel planned, it doesn't feel well designed. It looks like you didn't really plan it because you didn't. You just started putting stuff on the wall without any regard to shape or size or consistency or anything like that. It doesn't look well designed because it wasn't well designed. You threw a bunch of stuff on the wall and it just didn't work out. So don't just start putting stuff on the wall. Always make sure you have a plan, map everything out beautifully, including all the spacing between all the different objects, which we'll get to. Okay, my next do is for you to consider size, shape, and scale when looking at your gallery wall. So consider different sizes and shapes, but also really appreciate the scale on what it's going to look like in the wall that you're doing it on. So if you're going with a really big wall, maybe it's like a double height ceiling and you're going with a really huge space and you want to fill it up with a really kind of interesting, beautiful gallery wall. Maybe consider going with larger objects that are going to fit the scale of the type of wall that you're going to be using for the gallery wall. And consider using multiple different sizes or shapes of different, rectangles, or you can maybe even position them vertically, or you can position them horizontally. Consider things that are round in shape. You might consider a mirror, so mixing up the shapes a little bit versus just using the same rectangle picture frames that might make up the majority of your gallery wall. So maybe considering different shapes as well. Playing with different size, but being conscious of the fact that something really small next to something really big is obviously going to provide a huge contrast. You might want to mix different sizes and shapes, but it's proportional to the scale of the whole gallery wall that you have planned out. See tip 1. You don't want to just pick a bunch of items that are either going to overwhelm the space or they're going to be too small and they're not going to feel like they're going to fit the size of the wall that you've selected, because if you do that, it's just going to look silly. Okay, which leads me to my next don't, which is don't overcrowd the wall. Okay, and specifically when I'm talking about overcrowding is I'm talking about two things. So number one, I'm talking about the whole gallery wall in relation to the wall that you've selected. Leave some breathing space around the wall. Don't have the edge of your gallery wall to butt up against the edge of the wall that you've selected. Does that make sense? You want to make sure that there's some breathing space around it. So again, see tip 1, when you're planning out the gallery wall, you want to make sure that there's some space above, below, and to the side of the wall that you have selected. So there's some breathing space around the whole gallery wall, because you're considering the whole wall together when you're putting it, right? You're not just considering the individual pieces, you're looking at when they all form together so that they're one unit, how does that work on the wall that you've selected so that there's enough white space around it so it has a little bit of a space to breathe. The other thing that you should consider is within the gallery wall is how much space is being left in between the individual pieces. Because what you don't want is you don't want them to feel like there's just butting right up against each other, or that they're so close or so crowded. It's really gonna feel a little bit too busy and a little bit too overcrowded, and you wanna give a little bit of white space, a little bit of breathing room to all the different pieces that you have in your gallery. Now, the tricky part in a YouTube video is trying to give you specific measurements of what sort of makes sense. I would say something like 2 or 3 inches, which is about 5 to 7.5 centimeters between each piece, is a good kind of rough rule. However, scale is really gonna matter here, right? Because if you're using it on a really small wall and it's just a few pieces, you might be able to get away with less depending. And if it's a really large wall, in order for to match the scale of the wall that you're doing or the size of the gallery, you're gonna want to have maybe a little bit more more space between each object. So it's kind of difficult for me to say how much space between each piece, but I would say 2 or 3 inches is kind of a good average rule. Okay, my next do is to tie the gallery wall into the rest of the space, the rest of the room and the home in general. Really what we're going after here is you want to tie this gallery wall to cohesively work with the rest of your space. So sometimes, because the gallery wall can look really overwhelming, you want to make sure that it belongs with the rest of your space and that it doesn't feel like super busy and overwhelming. And so one of the things that you can do is consider using the same frame. If you're really worried about something that's going to look a little bit too eclectic, a little bit too funky, and you want to more err on the side of something a little bit more formal, then consider opting for the same frame. That can look really beautiful. But if you want to add a little bit of color and you want to add something that's a little bit more casual and you've got lots of sort of different elements going on, still focus on the different pieces, or say the frames or the art pieces that you select, or the different pieces that are in the gallery wall. Think of how they're going to work with other areas of the room. So I'm going to give you an example. So if you take a look at this image, you can see that this is a really beautiful gallery wall, some really gorgeous art there, but look how cohesively you can see how colors and textures, specifically the metallics, work with both the gallery wall and the other pieces in the home. So you've got the leather chair as well as the brown piano, and then you've got that beautiful brown frame that's in the gallery wall. That's definitely not an accident. You've also got the gold frame there up in the top left, which that gold brass color I think works really well with the brass that you're seeing in the lighting fixture. It also looks like there might be brass on the legs. That's kind of an interesting sort of touch, so you can see that they're pulling that together. There's also another brass frame there as well. Plus you've selected a very monochromatic sort of color scheme in the art. It's all black and white. You know, I think it kind of works also with the black and white keys of the piano, as well as there's black and sort of some off-white there in the rug. So you can see all these different pieces are there to work together, and you can see that they're pulling these colors and metallics from the art or from the frame, and they're bringing it into the rest of the room. I love that. You can see I've got another couple of examples here that are kind of doing the same thing. I won't go through them as in depth, but as you can see, they're bringing in a lot of these colors and textures from the art and from the frames, and they're sort of bringing it into the rest of the space. If you had selected different art, or if you had selected different color frames, it might not have looked as cohesive, and it wouldn't have brought the gallery wall back together and connecting it with the rest of the space quite as effectively as it does in these photos. Okay, my next don't is don't hang your gallery wall too high. Okay, so I have a couple of videos, specifically this one that I'm going to link here, I guess, talking about measurements and making sure that you get the right height for different art pieces. And that is true for a gallery wall. But the important point I want to hit home in this video is just to really consider the gallery wall as sort of one unit together in a space, right? So you're considering the whole piece together. So if you're hanging it way too high, it's going to look silly. It's going to look weird. If you plan on putting it, say, over a sideboard or over a couch or over maybe, you know, behind your bed frame or something like that, I would say 5 to 8 inches above the top of the couch or the headboard or the sideboard or whatever you're using is kind of a good rule. But again, what I really want to get across here is that you're considering the whole gallery wall together, not just the individual pieces when looking at hanging them at the right height, and don't hang them too high. It just looks weird. Okay, my next do is to consider adding textures or different mediums to your gallery wall. So you don't have to stick to just plain picture frames, although that can be beautiful as well, but you can mix in different textures. If you love, maybe you're a lover of macrame, you can consider that. You could use something like a clock. You could use different textures. You could use wood. You can use cement. Maybe you got like a really kind of clock like I do or something like that, and you want to sort of feature that in. All that stuff really works. I would say as a general rule, the more eclectic and sort of funky and casual you want to make something, the more textures and the more different shapes and sizes and pieces that you want to use, that's probably going to be more effective. If you're looking for something a little bit more formal, I would consider using maybe the same material or sort of less textures and less sort of differences and variations in the materials that you're using. But overall, I think you shouldn't be necessarily afraid of using textures and colors and materials in your gallery wall. You don't just have to stick to picture frames, although that can also just be a really beautiful look too. My next don't is don't use all generic art. So I've mentioned this a bunch of times on this channel. You know I'm not a big fan of just the plain old live, laugh, love word art. We're looking for something a little bit more special, but I really wanted to touch on it with a gallery wall because I wanted to talk about What I love about gallery walls is it is so personal for people. It's designed so that you can bring in things that you've maybe experienced in the past, things that you love, maybe a quote that you love. I'm not saying you don't have to use any word art. I might not be the biggest fan of it all the time, but I would just say don't overdo the really generic stuff. You want to make it really personal because that's what's great about a gallery wall. You can have some photos of friends and family if you want to do that. You can do places that you've traveled. You can do pieces that you've maybe brought home, souvenirs that you've, collected over the years from different places that you've gone to. These are some of the things that I think makes a really personal and interesting gallery wall rather than choosing sort of generic art that you've picked up at your local big box store. Not saying you can't ever use that stuff. I mean, I generally advise that it's the more personal and the more meaningful, the better. But maybe you have a favorite quote and you want to include that in your gallery wall. I'm not going to say don't do it at all. I'm just saying don't overload the wall with nothing but generic art. It doesn't look good. It just looks weird. And skip the IKEA prints and just putting them all together in one gallery wall. It just never looks good and it never looks well designed and it always looks plain and boring because that's what it is, plain and boring. And that brings me to my next do, which is to inject personality into your gallery wall. So building on the last point, yes, include things from your travels, things that you really love. If you're a lover of like vinyl or maybe vintage magazine covers or, record covers, I don't know what you're into. Like, you do what makes sense for you because that's what you love and that's what I think makes a really sort of personal and interesting gallery wall. So grab things that you really enjoy that you want to show off. This is a really great way to do it. And really think of the experience that you want to sort of create with the gallery wall. So yes, you can grab a whole bunch of stuff that maybe you've collected in the past and throw it up on that wall. Sure, that's an option, but maybe curate a little bit and think about how you can connect these different pieces in sort of meaningful ways. Okay, so final thoughts on gallery walls. I think that they can be really, really tricky. I would say one of the best ways to look at a gallery wall is to think that what is the mood of the space that you're trying to create? Do you want to create something that's really personal and really maybe casual? If that's sort of the vibe of the space that you're trying to create, then I would say have a little bit more fun with textures and colors and materials. You can be a little bit more playful and a little bit more eclectic with all the different pieces that you're putting in your gallery wall. If you're going for something a little bit more formal, if you're going for something that's a little bit more buttoned up and you don't want that sort of free-flowing funkiness in your space, that's not the vibe that you're going for, then maybe consider something where you're seeing a lot more consistency in the materials, consistency in the size and the shape. That is going to provide something that's a little bit more formal. Consider like an art gallery, right? Like if you go to an art gallery, they don't just put all the pieces on the wall. You're going to see a little bit more consistency and uniformity in the space, and that's going to create something that's a lot more formal. When you're considering what type of gallery wall you want to do, I would really consider the sort of mood and the feel of the space, and that's going to really help guide you through, as well as all the tips that I've included in this video. So if you want that really formal art gallery sort of space, consider more consistency, and if you're looking for that funky, weird boho space, consider more of that sort of variation and asymmetry. So that's it for me for today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to link actually to my video for boho. I did a video on boho where I outlined all the details of what makes up boho design from my perspective, and I think you might really enjoy that video because a gallery wall isn't out of place in a boho space. I'm not gonna lie. So I'll see you all in that video. Thanks, bye.